In my last video I customized a cassette so that I could get one that ran from 13 to 30 teeth, and I tested that and it worked well. I've recently customized this, a second cassette, which was originally an 11 to 28 cassette. Now I've customized it into a 13 to 28 tooth cassette. Initially, when I first tested it, changed cleanly up from each sprocket. However, for reasons I won't go into, I took it apart and then put it back together. On putting it back together, this happened. It started jumping on the 14 and 15 tooth sprockets. To fit in as many speeds as possible, the chain and the sprockets have quite close tolerances. Small changes can cause the chain to interfere with the sprocket next to it. Now, when I first put it together, it must have just gone into a position where that interference didn't take place. And then when I took it apart and put it back together again, things moved a little bit and they started to interfere. I could take the cassette apart again, reassemble it and hope it would start working again, but that's not really a very satisfactory solution. I spent a little time rotating the chain across those sprockets in order to identify where the chain was interfering with which sprocket teeth, and then I marked those sprocket teeth. My plan was then to file a small amount off of each of those teeth that were causing the problem in order to give them more clearance. On taking the cassette off, I found another issue. You may remember that I had to find an extra spacer, and that I took off of a 9-speed cassette, but it was slightly too thick, so I had to sand it down. It started off at 2.6mm thick, and I had to sand it down to 2.1mm. This extra spacer has a lot less surface area than the standard spacer that came with the cassette. When I reassembled the cassette for the second time, I actually tightened the lock ring down quite extensively, and what seems to have happened is that this extra spacer, because it has a smaller surface area, and I think it's probably made of a slightly softer material, preferentially compressed relative to the other spacers. That means the gap between the 14 and 15 tooth sprocket was actually slightly too small. I estimate it was about 0.15mm too small, and indeed when I took this spacer off and I measured it, I found that it was actually slightly undersized. What seems to have happened is when I tighten the lock ring up, this has been compressed down by about 0.1 That was enough that the gap was slightly too small for the chain to fit into. That caused the pins on the chain to start interfering with some of the sprocket teeth. I've put a new spacer on there now that's 2.3mm thick, and the gear change is now fine. Not only here on the bench, as you can see, but also I tested it out on the road today and it all worked fine. Anyway, from me for now, it's goodbye.